Friends, there's been a lot of debate recently on the continued validity of open world game design. There's been very strong points on both sides as to whether open world games have become boring or if they still have a lot of merit. Well-crafted and thorough examinations of the genre, if it could be called a genre in and of itself, have come from such excellent channels here on YouTube as Internet Pit Stop, who I think is f***ing brilliant and hilarious. Nerds from Arizona, my dude. However, I think open world games in and of themselves are getting a bit beat up lately. I'm personally still a fan and I find the prospect of an open world game exciting. Let's take a quick look at the origins of open world games, why people feel they're getting stagnant, and why I still like them. Welcome aboard Space Castle, where it's our continuing mission to explore all things nerdy in the universe. I'm your Captain DT, and I'm stepping up and going to bat for open world games. But maybe not in the way you'd expect.
So this is one of those clickbait videos then?
Well, no, I don't think so. The thumbnail isn't me screaming like somebody just landed a hot air balloon on top of my dog or something.
Yes, well, maybe you should. Hang on, let me whip something up. Oh, yes.
They're right. AI has gotten too powerful and you must be stopped. So open world gaming all started back in 1970. Yes, 1970 if you can believe it. The very first free roaming game and possibly the first flight simulator and first-person shooter may have quite possibly been Sega's Jet Rocket arcade game. And it might be more accurate to call it an arcade amusement or an attraction. See, it wasn't exactly a video game, but a rather clever and ahead of its time kiosk with backlit 2D maps that moved on rollers as you, the pilot of a bomber plane, freely navigated in any direction you choose. It used light projection to simulate gunfire and bomb droppings, and the player was free to attack and destroy enemies in any order they saw fit. It was something of a technological wonder back in 1970, really. And it directly influenced multiple game genres going forward and helped spark our global interest in open world gaming decades before the likes of Assassin's Creed or Breath of the Wild. Fast forward to 11 years later to 1981, and open world exploration made its way to video gaming proper. ULTIMA for the Apple II, which sparked a whole series of games and would soon come to be known as ULTIMA 1, the First Age of Darkness, was created by Richard Garriott and was the first official open world computer game. Developed and finished in less than a year by Garriott and his friend Ken Arnold, ULTIMA was a massive game for the time. A game world split between 4 continents containing castles, various towns, dungeons, and wilderness areas to explore, a game that would shift between top-down and first-person camera angles depending on the situation, and a game that translated the love and excitement of tabletop RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons to the realm of video games. The game was wildly influential on all video game RPGs to come after it. Video games like, Legend of Zelda. Creator, visionary, and top on my list of people to meet before I die, Shigeru Miyamoto was directly influenced by ULTIMA's dungeon crawling style and the way the world was navigated using tile-based exploration. 1986's The Legend of Zelda, tied in with 1984's Hydlide by T&E Soft, ushered in free-roaming, open-world style exploration to console gaming and made it much more accessible and less exclusive. Because if you didn't know, the Apple II was like $1,300 when it came out. In 1977, that's equivalent to like $6,000 in 2024 money. The $150 price tag of the NES in 1985 was much easier to swallow for the average household. And by the way, I don't want to sell a Zelda or Hydlide short in this video. I'm sure you're acutely aware of Zelda and don't need much explanation there, but I highly recommend checking out Jeremy Parrish's recent video on Hydlide in the 124th episode of his fantastic NES Works series here on YouTube. There'll be a card up above for you to click on, and I'll have it as a suggested video at the end of this one. If you haven't already subscribed to his channel, do it the moment you cruise on over there. Suffice to say, Hydlide is a weird animal and not entirely successful in and of itself, but its influence is gigantic and very apparent from the jump. With over 40 years of groundwork laid for open world gaming, over 50 if you count Sega's Jet Rocket, it's now all the rage and damn near a set standard for video games in general. We're inundated with the likes of Assassin's Creed, The Elder Scrolls, Horizon, the reinvented take on The Legend of Zelda, and many more, all of which are vying for our attention and our dollars. boasting bigger and more detailed worlds with more to do in each new release. So, why are people bored with open world gaming? And why do I still think that open world games are okay? Most people think that open world games have become too routine and the gameplay cycle is always the same, and I don't disagree. After the intro sequence of most of these games, you're dropped into the world, and more often than not, you're directed to the first of many map markers, usually in the form of waypoints or towers, to reveal a portion of the world map. Then within that portion of the map, you're directed to explore and complete a handful of objectives before you're just turned loose and allowed to activate waypoints and do non-story missions in whatever order you like. And I'm okay with that because, game developers have to think in terms of both veteran gamers and first-timers who are trying out a game like this for possibly the first time. Man, I think that once we're turned loose and left to our own devices is where things start to feel a little conflicting. Now, first and foremost, my favorite example of open-world gameplay is Elder Scrolls IV: Oblivion. Released in 2006 by Bethesda Softworks and the fourth installment in the series, duh. The game drops you into a prison cell, allows you to create your character, and thrusts you into an escape mission before tossing you out of a drainage gate and into the world with very little in the way of clues or hints on where to go next. I f***ing love that, and I think most people do too. I would bet dollars to donuts that Oblivion is most people's favorite example of open world gameplay. You're barely geared up, you're low level, it's likely nighttime when you're turned loose on the world, and nothing in the game tells you who you are or what you're supposed to be. You're free to make all that up in your head, and you can go right straight to the very first alien ruin you see across the water and learn the ins and outs of exploration and combat against something besides rats, or you can about face and go any which direction you want. You can spend dozens, if not hundreds of hours in the world of Oblivion before even taking on the first real story mission. And all of that exploration is rewarding in the form of puzzles, fun combat, leveling up, finding new gear and weapons, and uncovering mysteries in this weird fantasy world. And it feels like anything can happen while you're doing so. You can come across people along the road who might turn out to be docile and friendly, or they could be bandits waiting to hold you up and try and rob you. You can come across wild animals that will attack and yield resources if you can kill them. You can find a new cave or a ruin, and you're always rewarded with something valuable for your time. It's no wonder why each of these Elder Scrolls games take forever to create. The Kingdom of Cyrodiil in Oblivion is 16 square miles, and not a foot of it feels wasted. That's nearly the size of Manhattan, and it's a video game world that feels alive and dangerous, that like any direction you take will lead you to something interesting and fun to do. And yet it also never feels overwhelming or like a chore. There's not a gazillion markers on your map with a laundry list of menial tasks to accomplish. The game world is just there, wild and untamed, waiting for you whenever you want it, and discovery is half of the fun. And I think that's where people start to lose interest in open world games, because that sense of discovery takes a really f***ing long time to craft and get right, and too few games are making the attempt. There's a reason we've been waiting for what feels like decades for Elder Scrolls 6 to come out.
It's been 84 years.
And why Assassin's Creed games are gigantic, but everything feels sort of on rails and routine, and why they come out every other year. It's a huge open world, but the discovery is removed in order to make development of that world easier. You can crank out a big, detailed game world, but fleshing it out and filling it with organic discovery and activities takes a level of care, craft, and planning. Creating a genuinely thrilling and spontaneous feeling adventure for us gamers is years and years of thought and building on the part of a great developer. And that's a scary thing to do. Spending years of time and millions of dollars to create a world and simply letting gamers run wild in it without holding their hands? What if they don't get it? What if the flow between locations and discoveries isn't quite right and it ends up feeling empty? What if there's too much to do and we miss the quiet moments in a lovely game world that let us cool down and recoup after a stressful dungeon or a chance encounter with enemies? You don't really get any of that care with Ubisoft Assassin's Creed games. The motivation for Assassin's Creed has always been quantity over quality and giving players a million things to do to keep them occupied until the next game comes out. The time is spent creating a detailed world and filling it with content, but not making that content feel organic and causing us to invest mentally and emotionally in it. Okay, so if you put me in a room and you set a medium rare steak and a baked potato on a plate 2 feet away from me, point at it and tell me to get it, I'm gonna get it. And I'll probably like it. But if you put me in a room where I can smell the steak but not see it, and you tell me there's an incredible meal waiting for me in this room if I can find it, I'm going to be totally invested in a completely different way. The act of seeking out that steak dinner becomes as vitally important to the experience as simply sitting down and eating it. And I'll have a story to tell later of how I was able to find it and how much better it tasted after I earned it. Assassin's Creed games are 40 square miles of steak dinners, each just a few steps away, and yeah, you're gonna get sick of steak dinners served to you in that manner. The Elder Scrolls games are sprawling spaces where you can smell the steak, along with a variety of other meals, and you're left to try and find them on your own. And it's exciting and rewarding when you do so. And somewhere between Assassin's Creed's routine, monotonous, quick flow of content and the Elder Scrolls' more ponderous, freeballing method of doling out experiences to the gamer is... Released on March 7th of 2017, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild brought its franchise into the grandest sense of open-world gaming it may have seen up to that point. With the desire to recapture the feeling of mystery, danger, and exploration that the original ignited in many of us in 1986, it would change how we look at and feel about Zelda games forever. But it's also really f***ing divisive. Many people feel that the game world in Breath of the Wild is empty with very little content to delve into, and that what is there is tedious and repetitive and unrewarding. And I see where they're coming from. Hunting Koroks stops being interesting once you've gotten more than enough weapon, bow, and shield slots, and having 900 of them feels like equal parts overkill, but also making sure that the player will always come across enough of them for need. There's no sense of urgency or mystery to finding them, and the need for them is quickly deflated because you can always find more than enough on a regular basis. But I think Breath of the Wild's biggest downfall is... Okay, this is gonna blow your mind, so let's take a brief interlude to prepare you mentally. Breath of the Wild's biggest problem is the shrines. I know, it's like Breath of the Wild's signature thing, but here's the issue. Ocarina of Time, which is arguably more linear than Breath of the Wild, is also much more rewarding in terms of exploration than Breath of the Wild. Because that exploration in the world rewards you directly instead of that exploration resulting in a new chore to finish. If you go snooping in a cave or your rumble pack starts vibrating next to a random tree, you know you're going to find something interesting in Ocarina of Time. In Breath of the Wild, you know that you're going to just find another shrine to accomplish. And the disconnect is that Ocarina will reward you with a piece of heart or a new item that will alter your journey going forward, and you find it within the game world. Breath of the Wild's exploration actually encourages a disconnect emotionally from Hyrule itself, because you have to enter a shrine to get a spirit orb, which you then have to collect in order to increase your health or stamina. Imagine how different Hyrule would feel in Breath of the Wild if you climbed an icy mountain in the middle of a snowstorm, you reached an ancient cave, explored it, defeated a powerful monster, and were rewarded with another quarter of a heart for your trouble, or a useful item that would change how you play the game. That would feel radically different than climbing that same mountain in Breath of the Wild just to find an alcove where another of the 120 shrines is tucked away and having to complete a potentially frustrating puzzle after you already made the challenging journey to get there. And therein lies the problem with most open world games. The minutia, the little in-between moments when we're not making our way through the big story beats and missions, just feel like filler without much reason to exist rather than an actual feature or part of the journey. They're not rewarding because every one of them doesn't feel like a special discovery or an accomplishment by us as the gamer. It just feels like we're going through the motions and only being rewarded with more work. So you're thinking, get to the point and justify that thumbnail, DT. Why do you still like open world games?
I'm constantly waiting for you to get to the point. My God, do you ever pee or drink water?
Because I am someone who, for as long as I can remember, I've always told a story within the story to myself while playing a game. I engross myself in the story, and I try and think and act as the character in the game would, and I try and view that game and the story through the character's lens. I've done this as far back as Mario, wondering what he was thinking and feeling in his gauntlet run through the Mushroom Kingdom to try and save Princess Toadstool. And then less linear games like The Legend of Zelda came along and set my imagination ablaze. I was playing a character on a mysterious adventure where it was my job to figure out the secrets, find locations that weren't always obvious or easy to get to, and I developed an emotional attachment to Link as I played the game. I was the internal narrator for the character and the story, playing through the game as I would imagine he would navigate Hyrule. And then games like Elder Scrolls came along and just absolutely rewarded my way of playing games in the biggest way I can imagine. Morrowind, Oblivion, and Skyrim were wonderful, thrilling escapes for me because I invested so much thought and time while playing them. It wasn't just turning off my brain and playing them like I would something like Tetris or Mario Kart. But I recognize that not everyone can or does play games the way I do, and I think that's where the disconnect between open world gaming and gamers themselves happens. It's too much effort to create an open world game that's not linear and straightforward in its exploration and gameplay, but it's also become the standard and what people expect. So the many gamers who just want to disconnect and turn off their brains and have a relaxing time are stuck in this loop of open worlds designed out of obligation by developers that require the player to make their own fun and context. And I'm a weirdo who's able to do that on a regular basis. And developers think that if a game isn't open world, it's going to be viewed as lazy and boring and probably too short and not worth the purchase. So we're stuck in a painful loop together where nobody's really getting what they want. I mean, when Final Fantasy XVI was announced, a lot of people actually turned their noses up to the fact that it wasn't going to be open world, despite the fact that Final Fantasy games are largely linear. Yes, even Final Fantasy VII, I don't care that there's a world map to explore. How much can you actually do in that open world that's not just repetitive tasks like grinding for the Knights of the Round material? But guess what? Final Fantasy XVI was fucking amazing. The characters are wonderful, the narrative is fantastic, and all of it has a crisp and tangible sense of direction and planning. Because Yoshi P and his teams didn't have to worry about creating an open world, just a really good one. We need to stop expecting every game to be open world and then act disappointed when it stretches a game's development too thin. And developers, you need to stop kowtowing to the idea that if a game isn't open world, then people aren't going to buy it. Just make good games. If your game's story lends itself to being an open world, then do it. If your game is much more character-driven and story-driven, then give players enough agency as your story needs, but don't go to such efforts to create these massive and yet soulless open worlds that don't reinforce the point of your game and the experience to begin with. And that goes for you too, Nintendo. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are both lovely sandboxes to mess around in aimlessly, but I don't really feel that ultimately the open world did much to strengthen the balance between exploration and story. So there you go. I still like exploring open world games, but I realize that I am the weirdo outlier because I constantly create my own context for it. And I see where that's totally exhausting to some people and why they might feel it shouldn't be necessary. And they're probably right. Open world games should be a special thing when it's called for and not simply there because of some self-imposed demand for it. We shouldn't also be afraid to pay for a game that isn't 100 hours of mindless drudgery and be okay with spending that money on a really great 20 to 30 hour experience. What do you think? Am I full of crap?
Usually, yes.
Or do you agree with my take on open world games? What's your favorite example of an open world game done totally right? Leave a comment down below and let's talk about it. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with a friend so you'll be ready for the next discussion. In the meantime, thanks as always for hanging out with me here on Space Castle, where it's our continuing mission to explore all things nerdy in the universe. This is your Captain DT, signing off.